do something good.
Hi there. We are live here. I'm with Tommy Bruno, my classmate from high school and one of the best sculptors in New Orleans. His Lee is coming along.
Yes, we're
Fabulous.
coming along.
Tommy, every Saturday, huh?
Yes, indeed. So I filled it out. Start trying, continue to work the jacket, get some more of the shape of the boots in. Worked one of the gloves, and then I went into the head and started to get the hat. I wanted to get a nice sense of the overall height of the piece, so I wanted to get that hat on as soon as I could, but I had to establish the size of the head first, and then I could put the hat on properly. So now we've got the hat blocked in, I'm working on the rim, and then I've blocked in the beard, and I've started to develop the collar around this jacket. One of the things I was concerned about is this fullness in the chest of the figure. He's really projecting out rather unnaturally, I would say. But from a distance, it looks very commanding and powerful. So he's got a very projecting type of chest on which his arms rest.
Well, you know, Lee, as I read about Lee this week, his history is amazing.
Yeah.
He got assigned to go to Mexico, and he comes through New Orleans. He's in New York.
Right.
Takes a steamboat. He buys a horse here called Grace Darling while he's in New Orleans. Rides it to Mexico. He's basically a civil engineer, designing a path to get into the Santa Anna's armies. And his guy doesn't show up. He does it by himself. He goes behind enemy lines.
Incredible.
So they have a chest like you're talking about. This was a man.
This man had a chest, I'm going to tell you what.
He was the hero of that war,
yes,
what he did.
absolutely.
And then he goes to West Point, and he's the leader. So
yes, indeed.
Imagine, trying to be the guy to control all of these West Point, these Army guys.
That's right.
I'm thinking he must have had a chest.
Well, I don't know how many people know this, but Robert E. Lee is one of the few men that ever went to West Point that never did have a demerit.
Right.
Which is it's just a mind-boggling achievement. So his stature amongst the cadets must have been stellar. I mean, it was looked up to him as second to God himself.
And, I read he was second academically with no demerits. And he had one guy that always beat him. And we always know that when we were classmates.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was Moises Arriaga.
Yeah, Moises.
And Glenn Tracy.
That's right.
They were always 1-2 for the valedictorian.
That's
deal.
right. That's
so
right. I didn't have to worry about any of that myself.
I didn't either. But Lee was dying to finish first.
Yes,
and
he
this
was.
one guy just always a little bit better than him.
Yes,
but with no demerits.
That's right.
And then as an engineer, now that would really be the equivalent of Stanford, Harvard, MIT.
Absolutely.
Engineering today.
Absolutely. Just an extraordinary human being, so well respected in his day. His personal conduct was stellar. His professional conduct was extraordinary.
Actually, I want to share something with you. Last Sunday, a guy sent me a note. A colonel from West Point named Ty Seidule was actually at Washington and Lee in the chapel telling the students that they should reevaluate if Lee should be on the university. And I was just stunned because as I thought this guy that he's actually telling these students that they looked at Lee doesn't deserve maybe to be on the university name.
Yeah, this is a brutal time. This is a brutal time. What we're doing in doing this sort of thing is we're focusing in on the tiny little speck. Christ talks about it in the New Testament. These folks want to remove the mote from the eye of their enemy, but they don't want to notice the plank in their own eye. And this is precisely what's happening now. Robert E. Lee, who was probably, if not indisputably, one of the most respected people of his time, in his personal behavior, his professional behavior, they want to remove the mote, which incidentally he himself never endorsed. That goes being racism, the charge of racism, the charge of sympathy with slavery. None of these things that he possessed himself, but he's associated with them because of his association with the Confederacy. Fair enough. We understand that. His reasons for fighting with the Confederacy had little to do with slavery or with racism. Nonetheless, he did make a choice to fight with the Confederacy, and he himself would be the first man to acknowledge the association. But understand what we're doing. We're trashing a whole set of values, a whole set of aspirations because of an association, which on many levels is highly, highly unfair.
Now I'll add with that because it's been a busy week actually.
Right.
Dallas as well.
Right.
They removed Lee and they renamed the
Right.
park. FDR dedicated that, spoke of this man and his religious beliefs, his being a gentleman as well as a warrior.
Yes.
Down the street here, World War II Museum, Eisenhower did the same thing.
That's right.
So we're taking this man who basically, he was in San Antonio, running the cavalry in San Antonio when Lincoln decided he wanted him to run the Union Army. Lincoln says, take over the army, we want you to invade Virginia, your home state.
That's right.
And he says, you know, Mr. President, I can't do that, and I guess I should resign. So that was what he saw. It was like the president today said, I want you to invade Louisiana. What would you do?
I tell you what I would do. I don't know what I would do. I mean, we hear this talk about secession. We hear people disgruntled with the United States, with the union that we've established. And what folks need to step back and understand is that the alternatives are pretty frightening. That you're talking about true, legitimate, bona fide societal divisions. I mean, these are not just, I disagree. This is about, this is my country, that's your country. This is my set of laws, that's your set of laws. When you start to talk in that way, you move in that direction, all kinds of divisions and factions are going to occur. Think about what would happen if one section of Louisiana decided it wanted to move away from the United States, and another section said, oh no, we want to stay.
Like Southern California doesn't
Oh
want
my
to walk.
goodness!
Yeah.
The whole chunks of California that are very, very loyal to the United States. There are other parts that are very disgruntled with the way things are going in the federal government. The whole idea between of having a federalist system was to divvy up the amount of power that any particular governmental institution held, so that if a particular group of people were disgruntled with the way in which power was being manifested, they could seek out alternative institutions. They could go to other levels of government and seek some sort of a balancing.
Sure.
What's happened is so much power has been concentrated in the federal government that these kinds of mechanisms are no longer working for folks.
Absolutely.
And we need to dilute and we need to reapportion the amount of power that all of these governmental levels have. That is going to do, to a large extent, to diffuse this whole tension that's building up in the country. But until that happens, we have to understand there's a lot of factions out there that are using people like Robert E. Lee. They're using our history to foment disgruntlement, they foment discontentment, to foment disrespect for these institutions that are actually holding us together. That are the fountainhead of respect that we have for each other.
And Lee, I mean, Washington and Lee, he was actually one of our first think tanks.
Yes.
He figured out one of the most important ones. How does the country come back together? Do you deny the right to vote? Do you give the right to vote? Do you let them keep their guns, their horses? Lee really seemed like he was even ahead of that, because he said, you know, if you just give 4 million people freedom without education, without the ability to get a job, are you going to have mass chaos? You're going to have Jim Crow. It seemed like he was always 5 years ahead.
I think he was 100 years ahead of the country. Because we're still struggling with it today.
We are.
So the thing about it is, the relationships between the North and the South was very tenuous. And one of the reasons it was tenuous is because there was very little understanding of the two regions.
Right.
There was very little communication between the two regions. People didn't travel as much. People were not able to go to the North and visit. People were not able to come to the South and visit. It was very difficult to do.
Well, what I just heard from Ty when I watched this thing, he said that the difference was when he said that states' rights, and it was the right to own slaves. It wasn't. It was the right to collect a tax and a tariff that you thought the federal government was excessive. So the states in the South said this tariff is excessive and we have the right not to collect it. But what they also were upset about was the North was using those tariffs on the South and bankrupting the South to build a railroad to Chicago. That's right. So the railroad benefited commerce between the West Coast and the North and was built on Southern dollars. And there was just so much of this issue.
Well, like I've said earlier, Charlie, one of the problems we have with a federal government, that is a government in which we have levels of government. We have a national government, we have state governments, we have local governments. We're going to have instances of this where there is there is a movement of wealth from one area to another in order to benefit a particular region over another region. What we have to remember, though, is that when everything is said and done, we have to have this sense of plasticity in the way we think about political and economic power. We have to be able to bend and flex. If we're too rigid, if we're too insistent, if we're too adamant about our own prerogatives as opposed to someone else's prerogatives, we're going to devolve into a nation of warring factions. This is the one thing that Robert E. Lee understood probably better. He and Jefferson Davis, I should say. Both of these men understood, because they was one of the rare men that were able to travel through the North. And they saw what the North was like. The Northerners were not so well attuned and understanding of the Southern condition.
Tommy, the other thing that Ty, Colonel, and respectfully, anybody that's a colonel I respect, and I feel like he missed the point in so many spots what he gave last week at Robert E. Lee. He said that the South, the reason why Southerners, only 7% owned slaves, the reason why the other people would fight was they liked the idea that they were slaves because they could point to someone and say, you're lower down the ladder than I am.
Now, I don't know what to say about that.
I don't know what to say about that.
I find that claim extraordinary.
Well, this is my thought is, the North, I think, really wanted to be able to say that the South is down the ladder than the North.
Well, certainly we have that today. I mean, we definitely get looked at. We're made fun of in the media. We're made fun of in entertainment. The South is the punching bag. In every election, right, every national election, the Democrats come down to New Orleans and to remind folks about our racist, segregated past, and so therefore it reopens wounds that we would like to be able to heal.
And even the Civil War, what I've seen now is, as they call it in the North, the textbooks said it was a Civil War. In the South, these statues actually were a way of saying it wasn't Civil War because we formed our own country. And I wasn't here at that time. I mean, the Italians had come in 1910.
Right.
But they called it the Confederate. They didn't want to overthrow and tell New York what to do. They said it was the War of Southern Independence.
Right.
So the idea of calling it a Civil War when somebody does that, that means that Robert E. Lee actually was conniving with some other people on how to overthrow the government.
Yeah,
and tell people. But that wasn't the case.
No,
he was off in Texas doing his job, and he got caught up in this.
No, Robert E. Lee was a absolutely adamant supporter and servant of the United States. And it was only when it came to the very last moment, the last hour, that Robert E. Lee finally had to make a decision between fighting for his home state of Virginia or siding with the country of his birth, the country of his service, the country that he had given his entire life to. So this was a very, very, very difficult thing for Robert E. Lee to do. So what I would like to remind folks is that we have a complicated history, a history in which we have parts that we are not proud of, like racism and slavery and segregation. These are parts of our history we are not proud of. These are parts of our history which we acknowledge to be wrong. I think the Southerners, as far as I know, I can't speak for all Southerners, but everybody that I ever talked to is in full agreement about these three. We don't want to go back to segregation. We don't want to go back to slavery, and we certainly do want to live under the burden of racism, because racism is the pall of hatred, and none of us want to live like that.
Well, what got me is we obviously went to a Jesuit school, and I recently was talking to people at Loyola, going to college. There's actually a lot of money that is being given to give scholarships to help minorities. And that's been going on for decades. Right. By the Jesuits. Loyola has an amazing scholarship program. Right. So it's not just going back to racism and slavery. Right. There's an effort to be, how do we get together?
Of course. I mean, that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to push our values, our values about how people should be treated, that with respect, with dignity. We're pushing those values forward. That's why we want to understand, we want to think hard about folks like Robert E. Lee. Because Robert E. Lee is a wonderful example of a man who was torn, who was in conflict. I hate the word conflicted. The man was in conflict with the forces that were acting upon him at the time, and he tried his best to resolve those conflicts in the way that was going to be the best for the folks that he lived with. We don't always agree with the decisions that folks in the past have made, but we understand and we respect those decisions because we know they were made in good faith.
So I want to wrap it up, Tommy. Tell us a little bit more about the sculpture. When do you think it'll be done?
I don't really know yet. I think we've got at least maybe 3 or 4 more sessions here. Okay. I'm not sure. It all depends on how it shapes up. It's hard for me to project forward.
It's coming together.
Yes, and this is what has to happen. It's a slow process. It's a building up piece by piece. It's a conversation. It's a conversation where I speak, the statue speaks back, says, so how was your day? And then I respond, well, my day was great. But how was your day? No. It's a very, very difficult kind of back and forth.
And I'm an engineer, so actually I'm looking at this, and what amazes me is, how do you know how much clay to make an eyebrow and how much to make a mustache? I mean, you have it proportional. So when you're doing this, that is an art. You have the ability to just decide, I need this much.
Well, it's a lot of where the sculpting takes place is up here. Okay. This is where folks, I think, in a lot of ways, misunderstand the power of the imagination. Because imagination is not simply the projecting into reality something that doesn't exist. Imagination is reconstituting reality. It's, in other words, when we walk through the day and we see things around us, we're actually always creating the reality inside our heads. The difference is we're constantly being bombarded with information, and that constant feeding of information makes the reconstituting, our understanding of reality, that the thing that we see around us, more real, because what we see is confirmed. Now, if I'm making something that doesn't, like the statue, that doesn't exist, all I've got is a piece of wire and I have clay. So what I have to do is I have to assert from my mind what I see, and I get very little back. So the more I put down, the more information I can get back, and so it kind of snowballs into a kind of a full-blown conversation between the statue and me. But this is something that happens over time.
Gotcha. All right, Tommy, I want to thank you.
Charlie.
It's always a pleasure seeing you. And maybe you're going to be doing a little bit of swing dancing this weekend?
I'd like to think so.
It's a great place just down the street, the Cantina at the World War II Museum.
Yes, it is a fabulous place to go dance.
Take care, my brother.
Okay, God bless. All righty. All right, Charlie. That was kind of rough.
That was.